afternoon, everyone. I had to double check the time. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming. So I am Saunders. I'm an assistant professor here at Simmons SLIS, and this is Allison Estell, who is the Learning Commons librarian here at Beasley. And we are here to talk to you guys today about copyright. So we're going to tell you a little bit about the research that we've done and some of the results we found and stuff like that. But before we get right into that, we have a question.
Yes, I think that you thought you would learn things today, maybe passively receive, or if you know me, maybe come here to be entertained, perhaps. But actually, I am somewhat entertained. But we wanted to bring you in and get you engaged with thinking about the mindset that some of the people in our study might have had to be in. So let's go through a few scenarios. Start thinking what you might think you know or not know about copyright. True or false? You can link to a YouTube video in a course syllabus posted online on a course website that is not password protected. That is, it's open to the public.
So how many people say true?
I'm getting some maybe half or more yeses, trues, and some maybes.
All right, ready?
And the answer is true. Copyright law covers issues when you're making a copy of something. Now copies can be digital, posting a digital copy, whether you're scanning something to email or downloading something. These things can be copies, but actually linking to something is much more like saying, hey, see that book over there that's under copyright? If you go over there, you can look at it. It's not, you're not taking it. If you take it to the photocopy, that's another story. But a link is not a copy. So it is true that you can do that, even if it's not protected to the members of the class. Okay. Another scenario, very good. All right, true or false? You can post a scanned copy of an instructional workbook in a course management system as long as the course management system is password protected and access is limited to the students currently in the class. Let's see, so we're talking about a scanned copy of an instructional workbook inside a course management system like Moodle that is password protected and limited to people just in your class. How many people think this is true, that you can do this? We've got some people who think it is. And so it means that there's some people who either don't know or think that it isn't true. So we have a nice mix. What would be some of the things that are getting into your mind about why you think it is either true or false?
If it's an entire workbook, I'm not sure you can.
You're concerned about the fact that it's an entire workbook.
It's not a segment of it.
So in other words, how much of
Right,
it?
how much of
Very
it.
good. Yeah, that's concerning. Jeff?
Scanning the workbook and providing it to students could impact sales.
Yeah, the workbook.
The market for the things is very good. Other thoughts?
I feel like the professors do it anyway, so I mean.
Yes, well, I don't even know, but they're doing it anyway. Absolutely, that could happen.
Current athletics is doing it right
An
now.
entire workbook, not just.
Well, no, it's just sections every month, every week we do sections.
Intriguing. I'm not here to police anybody. No. And then none of this is legal advice, by the way. This is just information.
So what's the difference between workbook and manual?
Well,
Is it the same?
Yes.
Because it's called a manual, but every week we get one.
Yes, it very well may be. This will be interesting. Did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to say, because different manuals might have different licenses per book, per company.
And then there's licensing, which
Like
maybe you
if they
guys.
get CDs and stuff with them.
Yeah, absolutely. There could be licenses governing this. Again, licenses are like contracts. They're not even copyright law. They're just contract law. Absolutely. Well, in order to figure out if you could do this or not, I'm going to weigh in. I'm going to go with, what do we have on the next slide?
Okay.
I'm going to say false, that you cannot do this. And what this boils down to is that you would need to make a fair use assessment. Basically, you need to think about, is there some exception to copyright law? Okay, I want to make a copy. I'm making a copy, so I got to find an exception. And fair use usually is governed by 4 factors, which is I have abbreviations here, but what is the purpose? Are you doing it for a protected purpose, like something educational? And you would be in this case, and so that actually would tend to weigh on the fact that yes, maybe you can do this because it's an educational purpose. We're not trying to make money off of it. But what's the nature of the work you're copying? Sometimes this could be the difference between highly creative versus more factual. But in this case, this is where the manual versus workbook. If a manual is something you might consider as something consumable, like a workbook, this is not just a book you might read, but you actually have to interact with the workbook and give answers and actually engage with it in a way that it gets kind of consumed through someone's use. And so you need another copy for someone else to consume it. This would tend to cut against being able to do this. The amount, I think you mentioned the amount. Almost, it's really hard to make cases for showing for giving the entirety of something, although in film classes you could think of reasons why people might need to see the whole of a film to be able to educationally speak about it. But in this case, the entirety of a consumable thing. And as Jess pointed out, the market would be affected by this. People wouldn't buy these, they have the right to sell copies of this workbook, and we wouldn't be able to, we would be affecting the market for that. So again, it can go either way. A lot of the times on all these points, it's shades of meaning, it's risk that we're trying to take on for ourselves as users, but I would say you probably can't do that just because it is so much of a particular type of article, and even though the educational use is good, it's affecting the art. So just a couple more scenarios. Let's see what we got here. So here's a question. If you ask for permission from a copyright holder to quote short passages from their work in one of your papers, it's an academic paper, we can say it's for class or we can say it's for whatever academic purpose, and the permission is denied, you may not quote the work in your paper. Is that true or false? You ask for permission and they say no. Who thinks this is true, you can't do it? We got some people saying true, we need to respect the copyright holder. Then we get some people kind of,
Anyone
I
think
don't know.
false?
Rex thinks false, some other people think false. It's true, we want to respect the copyright holder, right? But the very concept of fair use, I'm going to go with false with a caveat here. Fair use is fair use. Like if you can make a fair use argument, then if we had determined that doing such a thing, quoting this in this academic paper was a fair use, that it was educational, that it wasn't affecting the market, the amount was limited and things like that, the nature of the work you were quoting was appropriate for this. If we made that determination, whether you view it as being an affirmative right that we as users have to use something fairly, or whether you view it as a restriction on the copyright holder, on the creator's rights, like I can do whatever I want with it because I created this thing, except for when there's a fair use. Whether it's a restriction on that or the one right that we have in copyright law as a user, either way, fair use is fair use, and actually even when you've asked for permission and it's denied, it doesn't create some sort of weird presumption that like against your argument. It doesn't say, well, these things are true, purpose, nature, amount, and market, but permission was denied, so we should probably, since we're on the fence, let's go with no. It's a no-go, it doesn't matter at all to your determination about it. So it's tricky though, and you want to do the right thing, and you want to respect the creator, but another thing about copyright is that it's designed to make people want to innovate and create more knowledge, which is not just the person creating it in the first place, but the ways that we can branch out and build upon already existing knowledge and materials and art and innovation. Yes?
Is that because library materials are like specifically published for use instead of something like an interview where if somebody says, you cannot use my words, you can't use them?
I'm not,
Like within journalism, if you were to state that like something was off the record and you had a conversation, you couldn't state that, but if something's published in a book, it's already in.
it has been published.
Yeah.
There is a difference between what's out there. If you went through and found somebody's diary in their backyard, you know, I mean, there's something, backyard, why would, I don't know. I was picturing it like we were digging through, but yeah, there is a difference, absolutely, between what's out there and what you put it out there in the world, and it's great, and it is yours, and we can't just do whatever we want with it, but absolutely, something that uses secrets and confidentiality and things like that, absolutely. These are really good points. Let's go through our last scenario.
one, yeah.
Under U.S. law, a work enters the public domain according to the laws of the country in which it was created. It's a fairly technical statement, but I'm wondering whether anybody has any thoughts. Public domain being the idea that you've put it out there, and it's been whatever period of time that we think it's okay for people to just do whatever they want with it. You know, or it's created by a government, and so therefore it's in the public domain, or whatever we might say. Under U.S. law, do you think it's true that it's according to the laws of the country in which this work was created?
I'm just saying, I think it's true.
You think it's true?
I think it would be the country in which it's published.
She's got published over here. Do I hear any other things? These are really good.
That's a trick question.
I would say, I want to say before we go to the next slide, it's gonna say false, but you're also right. Okay? So, strictly speaking, mostly usually, but I would say except for a nice person wearing a red shirt in the back. Because also, basically, in general, we think there is a difference between where something's created and where you publish it. And under US law, most works that have been created since 1978, the laws change constantly, have received copyright protection according to the lifetime of the creator plus 70 years. However, if they were never published, or they were published in other places, we can see like unpublished anonymous works, or unpublished works for hire, things like that. It's 120 years from the date of creation sometimes. And because it is so complicated, I wanted to just give you guys this little, I call it the hurdle chart. A lot of people do. Peter Hurdle created this really great chart about copyright term in the United States. And I think we might try to be able to show you what that looks like. Because we do have different, it's structured according to like what kind of work it is, what were the circumstances about publication versus registration, what you have like, who might be, what's in the public domain, things before 1895, if it was 120 years plus from the date of creation. We're going to see things here about, on this chart you'll also notice things about what if it was first published outside of the US. That would matter. What if it's a sound recording, or what if it's an architectural work? How much of this is, like, can we preserve those plans and things? It's a really great resource for you. So I just wanted to put that out there, and now we can go back to the slide presentation. And you guys have done a great job thinking about this already. And so I'm going to turn it over to Laura and talk a little bit about, we didn't give any little mini warm-up tests before we gave the survey to people. But yeah, basically fundamentally our survey is more about what we think we know versus what we actually know anyway. So I should have asked you, what do you think you know about copyright?
All right, so before we go any further, we just wanted to continue to ask you a couple questions. So the last question is, why is it important for librarians in particular to know about copyright?
Because we're giving information to users and we're pointing them to resources that they want to use for whatever purposes. So they need to understand how they can be used.
Good, right, yeah.
Because despite the fact that individual faculty members may be posting things outside of copyright restrictions, the institution is still held responsible oftentimes.
Yes, that is also very important, yeah.
Because we want everybody to like have the things they want and have fun with them, but we also want to make sure that people are still incentivized to create those good things and balance those things.
Yeah, exactly.
Could it be also that we are influencing practices, and practices are relevant for cases that are a little bit on the borderline, like fair use? So in the long term, in a way, librarians play a creative role.
I think there are cases absolutely where judges take a look at what are the best practices in the field. This is kind of like, I don't know, what are people really doing in libraries? I mean, I think the American Association of Research Libraries, that is to say, the ARL created a code of best practices for fair use just to talk about and try to advocate for what we think academic libraries should be able to do so that if any court cases come down, they'll see that we're kind of trying to adhere to this reasonable thing, absolutely.
Yep. No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think as Allison kind of illustrated with these questions, most of the copyright questions are not clear-cut, right? And so if they were to go to court, there's often a lot of leeway and a lot of discretion on the part of the judge to say, you know, exactly, like what is current practice? What are people actually doing out in the field? And that can definitely influence their judgment, which will then set precedent for later cases. So I think that that's definitely part of it. But the other thing is that definitely as librarians, first of all, in terms of our ethical code, obviously we're very much about access to information, but it is also part of our ethical code to protect people's intellectual property. So it's absolutely about striking that balance. And then also because we're guiding people. You know, and as we help them to access their information, we're often giving them instruction in terms of how to use these things ethically and legally. So if we don't know it, then we can't give our patrons good instruction. And then finally, just by default, a lot of librarians end up being the copyright experts in their institutions. And you know, whether this is right or wrong, for better or for worse, I often tell the story that I interviewed at a publishing company one time for a librarian position, and the woman in HR asked me, what did I know about copyright? And she said, you know, for instance, like if our lawyers had a question about it, could they come to you? No. What kind of sense does that make, right? So, but that's the way it is. I mean, people just kind of expect librarians, because we're dealing with information, because, you know, for whatever reason, And that means we're often setting the policy within our own institution. We want to make sure that we're aligning with what is expected in the law. Because, as I think Jess was saying, the institution will be held responsible ultimately. The individual might be too, but you know, just recently, within the last couple of years, Georgia State University was sued for the way that they were putting items on their e-reserve system. Even though the e-reserve system was password protected, the publishers, and I think it was Elsevier or Cisco, I can't remember. One of those
Elsevier was
yeah.
involved, I'm pretty sure.
You know, they said that it was breaking the copyright. Now, right now, it's still actually in litigation, but it started off that the judge was sort of leaning towards the publisher. The last sort of round, they were kind of backing off a little bit and saying no, that you know the university was within its rights. But the point is just that we don't want to put ourselves in that position where we're open to that kind of liability. So we need to go over. Yeah, thank you. So I want to just give you a little bit of background to the study before I turn it back over to Allison, and she'll walk you through our findings. But in particular, I'd like to point this out to the students in the room, that all of this really got started with an independent study that Allison wanted to do. So she came to me and she said she was interested in doing copyright. She wanted to do an independent study looking at how academic libraries set copyright policy. And I said to her, sure, like I thought it was a great idea, but you know, I kind of warned her up front. I'm like, I am not a copyright expert, right?
But she's an excellent collaborator.
But there you go. So I was like, I'm happy to oversee it, and you know. So we started off with that first independent study where Allison did a whole lot of legwork to look at policies around the country and to see how they were setting them, and starting to write actually a policy for the institution here at Simmons. And just around the time that she was finishing up that independent study, I got an invitation from a woman that I had worked with previously, a woman from Bulgaria who had developed this copyright literacy survey. And they had already taken the survey and pre-tested it. She had done it in Bulgaria, they had pre-tested it, or they had launched it after that in Turkey and France. And now she wanted to widen it out to a few other countries. So she asked me if I wanted to participate. And immediately I thought of Allison. And I thought, like, well, this is great. Like it really kind of follows up on the work she was already doing. So Allison did a second independent study where we took this survey that had been developed by this woman in Bulgaria, and we took a random sample of public and academic librarians throughout the United States, and we sent them this survey. And just to be clear, the survey basically, they called it, the people who developed it were calling it a copyright literacy survey. Really, it's a survey about people's perceptions of their copyright literacy, right? So basically all it asks people is, how familiar do you think you are with this copyright institution, or this kind of question, or et cetera, et cetera. So we'll kind of get into some of those findings. But just to know, just as a couple of points of interest, so Allison and I have finished this national survey. Obviously, we're giving you some of the preliminary data today, and within the next couple of weeks, probably, the study leaders in Bulgaria and France and Turkey are going to be compiling all of this international data and doing a cross-country comparison, which should be really interesting to see how their results align with ours, but we don't have that information yet. Yeah, so I already mentioned we had a random selection of subjects. What we did is we emailed the, I think it was the library director in each case, and asked them to fill it out, but we also encouraged them to send it to their staff as well. So I will give it back to Allison to talk about the findings.
And we did tinker ever so slightly with some of the language of certain questions, because it might not have been in the parlance of like U.S. copyright law. To try to, what are they trying to get at here, and what do we call that in the United States? So provincial of us, I know. But you know, we really want to get useful information. And so we did with the methodology of pulling those library directors from around the country and having them pass on the information to other people in their libraries. We did start out with 220 people who started the survey, and we noted that 149 completed it. So, you know, I don't know how many, that's a lot, I don't know. I'm trying to think compared to what we asked for. We got a reasonable number of people though. Whenever I'm calculating these figures though on percentages of respondents, I'm going based on the respondents for that actual question. So I'm always making it, if 178 people answered the question, my numbers are going to be based off of that. So you have it's not like of the people who decided to click on the link, how many people knew this? So these are pretty good numbers to show.
It was an email survey, SurveyMonkey or something like that?
Yes, well, so it was Lime Survey was the survey that they mounted it on, the people that we were working with, but yes, was all done by email web form.
And I don't know how many follow-ups we went with, but we emailed them initially and.
I think we did 2 follow-ups, so an initial invitation and then 2 reminders, and then we closed it out.
Yeah. And so it was actually very interesting. With each response as we progressed, there would be a certain number of people who didn't answer that exact question but hadn't left the survey. And I kind of leave those numbers out when you're going to see here. A lot of them have 5 choices, and so we're leaving out the 6th one, which is that they didn't respond to that, but they're still in the survey for other questions. We did get more people responding from academic libraries, but the public library information is interesting too. We're working with Mary Wilkins-Jordan a little bit on that. She's very interested in the responses from public library workers as well. Whether it reflects the profession or the people who are likely to do surveys or who knows what, but we had mostly female respondents. 70% of them were female, and 95% of them were over the age of 30. Maybe this reflects the fact that to advance in your career to library director, or wherever you've gotten into your, to get the invitation, maybe you've had to mature a little bit. But a very large percentage still, over 50% were actually over the age of 50. So this is a population that may, depending on when they enter the profession, may or may not have had a lot of experience with copyright. We did have, the majority were in the management, but also public services librarians who are what we would say were probably people who view themselves like reference or access services librarians, and fewer, other categories included IT librarians or workers and technical services workers. There were respondents in those categories as well. And again, most people have been working at just the current institution, not years in the profession, but their current institution for over 10 years is 60%, and 30% of people have been at their institution for over 20 years. And almost everybody had an LIS degree. 80% of people had a master's, which may or may not have been in LIS, but they might have had an extra subject master's or things like that. That wasn't granular at the point. I don't know if we have the ability to sort that out, but a high degree of training going in to the profession. So we put 2 questions on this first slide. What is your familiarity with copyright law? And then we have the 5 categories of not at all familiar, slightly, somewhat, moderately, and extremely. So as you can see, no one was extremely familiar with international copyright law, and no one claimed to be not at all familiar with national copyright law, which is great. But you can see the international, I hope can everyone see the blue-orange difference? If you can't, please let me know. I'm sorry about relying on color there. But so the international copyright law, you see people become like, so there's slightly, I've kind of heard that it exists, I'm aware of it, 30%, over, not quite 20% or somewhat, a little bit moderately, but then we see people getting more, a fair amount of moderately familiar with copyright law in our own country, which is great. Now this was distinguished with the next slide, which talks about people's familiarity with copyright institutions. And that would be like, it was just asked, what is your familiarity with national copyright institutions, just as the way it was phrased. Again, we're seeing the international institutions, the numbers are even greater here, 60%. Just not a lot of familiarity with international institutions, and not even a ton, somewhat moderately familiar or popular for national institutions. But the general sense of copyright law is more familiar to people than what are the institutions that we would be talking about when we're talking about how copyright is housed here in the United States. And then our next slide gets at, on the local level, some questions about where you actually work. Do you have a copyright policy? And happily, almost 70% of people say that they do. And I think it's a little over 15% say they don't. And then another good 15% that don't really know if they do or not. But still, that's a good number there. And then, is there a person at your institution in charge of dealing with copyright? This seems really good that we have a lot of yeses here. And we do have some no's, over 30%. Like that's almost a third of people thinking they don't have someone at their institution. And the reason this, to me, gets me a little bit nervous is there's an element of the copyright law called the Teach Act, which is section 110(2), I think, of the U.S. Code here. But the point is the Teach Act is governing online learning activities as opposed to the face-to-face classroom. And one of the requirements of the Teach Act is actually that you have a designated copyright agent at your institution. And so I'm wondering nervous. I'm not gonna talk about whether we're in this category or that category or anywhere, but we're doing our best. Everybody's doing their best, but also, again, these are not necessarily accurate responses about facts at the institution. These are about people's perceptions of what they know about their institution. So that's down to the local level here, people's familiarity with these kinds of things, policies and resources. Back to you guys. To get at some of the findings on specific categories, I thought we'd just open it up again for a little minor bit of discussion. Who feels vaguely familiar with, or slightly, or moderately, the concept of fair use? Okay, how many of you are feeling strongly familiar with fair use? A little bit, and somewhat, a little bit more. Is anybody, and it's okay, is anybody not at all familiar with fair use? And the reason I say it's okay is I heard there might be a copyright course here this summer. So you can always register for that. So, all right, let's go to the next slide, which talks about fair use and some associated kinds of concepts here. In this case, the blue, or all the way on the left, is fair use, and the orange is public domain, that concept of when things aren't governed by copyright anymore at all. And this green, or all the way on the right, is out-of-print works. And what that even means, we won't get into that right now. That's for a full copyright class. But these are kind of traditional concepts that have been long-standing. And as you can see, people are moderately familiar with all three of these things. And some people are even extremely familiar, somewhat familiar. It really skews a lot toward people knowing about these kinds of things.
It is interesting that we do have some people who are not at all familiar with any of these concepts. So
yeah, I think it is true, especially fair use, but I might be biased with that. But since we've just talked about it so much, how did they not hear me before they took the survey last summer? But yeah, it's not insignificant. Out-of-print works is maybe a little dicier, but and I get that that's a little higher. It seems appropriate, but still odd.
okay. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. How about this one? How many people feel that they're familiar with copyright concepts that work with in the online learning environment? I hope just a little bit. And how many people, just even moderately or like slightly, not so much, or a general sense that like it's being done, I don't really know, is it right or wrong? La 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 la. That's what. So there are a lot of issues in an online environment, online learning environment. This slide is actually called "In the Digital World" because we asked questions about how familiar people were with copyright law as it pertains to digital institutional repositories, something that a lot of institutions, including Simmons, are really working on, is trying to get their minds around how to do this fairly and appropriately and within the bounds of the law. Digitization is a really hot topic these days when people have their resources that are either degrading or just for convenience factors for students and really wanting to be able to teach online or just make their resources available more conveniently to even on-campus people. And then this actually was kind of an online learning environment question all the way on the right. We do see a lot more people who aren't familiar, although this is doubled out the scope. We're talking 20 here where 20 was way up on the slide before, but we're seeing that it's kind of all in the middle here for the green. There's just the outliers are out here, with the exception of the digital institutional repositories. I feel like that skews a little bit less familiar to people. And digital concepts are more emerging in some ways, so we'll have to see. But let's go to the next slide.
Yeah. And I do just want to point out, I mean, Allison did say it, but if you notice, the top of the axis here is 35%, so fewer than a third of the respondents were even moderately familiar with these concepts. So
yeah, I mean, if you put them together, it's a good chunk, but it really moderately, it's kind of, this is all, if you think about it moderately, it's almost like middle of the road. I think it's almost giving too much granularity underneath the moderate. And so we did put up a slide. There were questions about licensing. As I alluded to before, licensing is actually contract law, and it's not strictly speaking copyright, but I think because it governs what a user can do with information, and the way we're talking about copyright law right now is not creators' rights but the user's rights, I think it fits pretty nicely together with the things that librarians need to know. But as Laura said, librarians are being asked to, if not advise, give information to their patrons about things that users can do with information. And so the two questions involved, are you familiar with the licensing policies in your institution, and are you familiar with generally the concepts of licensing for information sources? And I mean, there's a little more familiarity with it in general, interestingly, than it is with the actual at your institution. But I mean, we'll have to see what that might be about if we were to get at it. Great. All right, one last question. Are you familiar with the term copyleft? Yeah, and
Well, I'll
Are
tell you,
you?
no, I was gonna say, when we got the survey, we were both like, what is this?
I gotta
So we
look
had
this
to
up.
look it up.
But let me ask another question before we go to the next screen. How many of you have heard of open access? Good. How many of you have heard of Creative Commons licensing structure? Good, yay, okay. So like just go to copyleft.org and you'll read it and you'll find that actually copyleft is kind of more of an activist movement to try to do things that open access is seeking to do, that Creative Commons licensing structures are trying to do, which is to say, we want to be able to create a portion of the society in which we create information and want to encourage its sharing rather than reserving rights to ourselves. So these three questions, it's very interesting. We wonder whether it's more prominent internationally as a term because you see, oh my gosh, over 70% of people had no idea. But when you start to look at, it's more evenly distributed. There's a good number of people who are moderately familiar with, 40% of people are moderately familiar with open access. When you put it together, it's almost 50% of people are moderately or strongly familiar with open access and things like that. But that's part of the fun of being part of an international survey is that you get to see the ways in which we get skewed into our own little countries, and there's a broader world out there, and we're all creating information. So that's a really interesting slide, I think. Now, if you need to go somewhere after this talk and just kind of, I want to know what that meant, or I encounter something new in my next job or whatever, where would you go for this information, and where are, in fact, librarians turning when they don't know the answers to things? And there was a wide range of, I believe these responses were set, and the other was a separate category, but these were the set categories. As you'll know, I'm going to break it down right about, let's see, right about here. The first 5 got more than half of people would turn to these resources, and these next 5, less or beyond, less than half of people would turn to these things. When you look at what people are turning to, they're turning to books and articles, websites, their colleagues, professional discussion lists, National Library and Professional Associations. Where they're not, less than 50% of people would turn to experts, or lawyers, and there's many reasons we can think about it, or blogs and wikis and things like that. I do have hypotheses about why this would be true. And then when you look down here, we've got less than 20% of people are turning to International Federation of, Federation of Library Associations. Exactly, of Library Associations, the World Intellectual Property Organization. That was totally theatrical, I totally did that. In the Electronic Information for Libraries Network, or the International Council of Archives or Museums. Fewer people are turning to that. And I guess I have a discussion slide for that later, but has everyone had a chance to absorb and thank you. So as you can see from these slides, there's some interesting hypotheses we could start to develop. A lot of the things that people felt comfortable with, are we going to view things like fair use and public domain? Are we going to view those as like long-standing traditional concepts, or is it really just that they're encountered more commonly in our work? When I think about the questions I get asked, so often it just amounts to a fair use determination, and that's just something I'm asked about a lot. I'm not asked about, less commonly am I asked about digitization things, and when I get asked about them, I'm like, and is it because I've never heard about it before, and that it's unfamiliar to me, or is it just that it's rarer and I don't have a chance to practice this as much? I mean, I would say that what they're familiar with, and the next slide about what they're less familiar with, I'm somewhat interested to find out whether it's long-standing and established, or it's common, and so I have to do it a lot, and so I'm good at it, And again, in addition to these, either whether you call digitization, copyleft, all these things to be emerging or just rarer that we encounter them. It turns out when you think about just the slide about the copyleft and Creative Commons and open access, they're all almost different, they're all in the same little basket there, and we were vastly familiar with vastly more familiar with the things that we encountered more commonly, rather than it being a conceptually new thing, compared to copyleft. Like, oh no, I get that, that's like this. And now maybe we know a little bit about copyleft. International areas were another thing where we really are dealing a lot with, much more comfortable with our own laws and our own institutions than we are internationally. And is that because we're like Americans? Or is it because we really don't have to deal with international things very often? I mean, it's hard to say. We do, I think Simmons might loan interlibrary loan internationally, or maybe we have cut that off because it's just too much to worry about. So these are things that would be really interesting to get at further. But I think my next slide, I did want to talk about the resources and some hypotheses about this. I feel like people are turning to the things that they can get to quickly and that they can feel very confidently that they can trust. They trust books and articles, and they trust whatever the other things were, colleagues, and they trust, whatever. It's right here. It's right here. And websites that they know they can go right to, and their professional associations. They trust these things. They're quick. They're trusted, and hopefully trustworthy. And what they're less. It takes a lot more time and copyright information literacy to go seek out blogs and wikis. You would really have to evaluate each resource. If you haven't been pointed there by the ALA or by a trusted colleague, you're not going to spend as much time on those blogs and wikis. Colleagues are right there. They're already getting paid like you. Lawyers cost extra. And a lot of places, they might want to consult attorneys, but they don't have the money to do so. Or they might want to consult experts, but again, how do I determine who's an expert if I haven't been pointed there by a trusted colleague? Also those international, a lot of those institutions near the end, the one that IFLA, and the World Intellectual Property Organization, these are international level institutions which we've already found that people are not as familiar with. We're more familiar with our national associations and things like that. So yeah, I would say that that's like some of the findings that we pulled out of the full questionnaire, and just a tiny little first ruminations about what some of those findings might be.
Yeah, and I'll get into the conclusions in a minute, but as Allison was saying, I mean, this was our preliminary look at the data, and it's all at the sort of very high aggregate level. But one of the things that we're interested in is to dig a little bit deeper and look at some of the correlations between, for instance, academic librarians' familiarity with some of these things versus public librarians. It might be interesting to see our academic librarians perhaps a little bit more familiar with international copyright law, because maybe they are dealing with more collaborations at that level or something like that, or not.
Well, and like the digital institutional repositories, I mean, there weren't a lot of public librarians in there dragging down results. No offense to public librarians, but no, I mean, really, it's something you don't think of as being necessarily a public library issue. You think of it as, so will it look any different if we just look at
so some of those things, like online learning, institutional repositories, we might expect academic librarians, their results to be a little bit different. So one of the things we'd like to do is drill down there. The other thing it might be to look at it by position description. So for instance, maybe public services librarians have a different level of familiarity than technical services librarians, or vice versa. So those are some of the things that we'd like to explore a little bit further. And then of course, eventually we'll look at the international data, and that should be really interesting as well. But the conclusions that we've been able to draw so far are that we need to know more about copyright. Definitely the levels of familiarity are not what we would hope for them to be. And again, this is also based on self-reporting. Now, what's interesting is it could be that people are underestimating their knowledge, right? I mean, it's possible that people are thinking, I know this is complicated, I know that I could get in trouble for doing this wrong, so I'm going to be very conservative. Or it could be, and maybe probably more likely, that they're even overestimating what they know. So keeping that in mind, we would definitely say that better understanding of copyright issues across the board is needed. And how are we going to get at that? Definitely more education in LIS programs. One of the things that Allison did just really quickly was to just skim through some of the curriculum descriptions for what, I guess the top 10 library schools?
Yeah, the top 10, this is 12 schools, because the top 10 is always more than 10. But yeah, there were hardly any.
There were very few, if any, courses, full courses devoted to copyright. Now, of course, there are courses that address copyright briefly within the sort of the curriculum of the course, but at any rate, you know, I think definitely we could say that more systematic education within the LIS programs is needed, and then probably more opportunities for people to learn through professional development, especially since, as we know, the laws keep changing, the issues keep changing. I mean, what we talked about mostly today was, you know, even if we weren't explicitly saying it, we were talking a lot about text sources or text that had been digitized, or maybe things like a YouTube link. But before we came down here, Allison and I were just throwing around scenarios. So Allison brought up this one idea of like, well, if Ansel Adams took a picture of that mountain and I take the exact same picture, am I going, whatever, violating his copyright? And I was like, good Lord. Right? These are the things that keep us up at night, right? Or of course, the whole music industry is another area, which academic librarians are, we're gonna be dealing with that, whether we're dealing with it ourselves or it's our students, there are all these areas. So beyond what we're going to learn in our LIS programs, hopefully, there needs to be more professional development devoted to this. On that topic, as Allison alluded to, Mary Wilkins Jordan is developing a copyright course that has been approved to the curriculum as a special topics course. So I believe it's going to be offered this summer, but I'm not absolutely sure if it will be summer or fall. But at any rate, for those of you who are interested, you can keep on the lookout for that. And then another idea is just to maybe find, and again, I think this would probably be through a professional association, to start developing clearinghouses, guides, things that sort of are self-service places that people could go to just find information, maybe like the Hurdle chart or something like that. And then finally, just in terms of further research, one of the things that we thought would be interesting to do, since this was based on people's self-perception, was to actually try to test knowledge, right? So actually ask people, like those true and false questions we asked you guys, to do a survey that got more at what people actually knew instead of what they say they know. And along the same lines, we were thinking about doing a series of interviews where we could ask librarians to talk about the copyright issues that they deal with on the job. So what kinds of questions come up? Where do you find yourself dealing with copyright directly? And have that kind of conversation about what they're actually seeing on the job that maybe eventually we could correlate to what they say they know about copyright.
Yeah, and there was, in the midst of all of this, there was an article that was published last spring about librarians' familiarity with copyright issues that covered a few topics. Maybe there were like 4 different topic areas. And it did try to get at, again, awareness of copyright. The article itself kind of plays out with more of a conflation between awareness and knowledge that we really are trying to avoid. And I think, and also there's a passage in there that really spoke to me because it was also almost conflating comfort with knowledge. And that's where I almost wonder that as you develop in a subject area and as you become further advanced, whether you're getting your master's or you get a PhD or just in your job, you become more familiar with and more expert in your field. I think you start to realize that the field isn't this big, it's this big. And you start to realize that I can't tell you how uncomfortable I was putting a true or a false on top of each of those slides. Because, I mean, I might have felt almost sophomorically earlier. The term sophomore, if you think about it, but let's keep it to the topic. Basically, the more familiar you get with copyright law and the more you know about it, you might become less and less comfortable because all of the granularity of the little differences in the, so I think that it's really important to get past awareness and comfort in terms like that, which are still really important for how we all feel in our jobs day to day. But if we're giving good advice, if we're giving good information, again, it's not legal advice, it's information. But yeah, it's really exciting to think about. Anybody have any questions or comments?
I've worked in academic publishing for a number of years, and I've noticed as I'm starting to do my job search now that a job title that's increasingly popular at the academic level is scholarly communications librarian. And they're working, to help university presses and to work with professors to publish their own information. So I'm really happy to hear that you're starting to look at copyright as a kind of a core element, because my assumption is that anybody who's working in scholarly communication really needs to be well versed and copyright laws.
I would absolutely say, and I think here at Simmons in particular, because copyright law encompasses two different sets of rights, the creator's rights and the user's rights. When we're talking about copyright here, at least at Simmons, we're talking about those user rights. And what Simmons likes to call the creator's rights is intellectual property rights. And we have a fairly robust policy for that, and that is really when we're talking about what professors are writing, what dissertations that are being created and stuff. It's like we have these two really important competing property rights in information and how we're then digitally or scholarly communication.
And the publisher's back in the middle.
Very good point, yeah.
Just on this point, I think this is a great research, and I'm so glad that you are trying to translate it into a proposal for a curriculum for our grad students. Should we make an effort on the basis of what you have discussed today, a conceptual one? Should we call these courses copyright courses, or think of a concept that includes fair use and copyleft, sharing, open, not in a subaltern or antagonistic position, but a more inclusive? It's a title that just doesn't remind us just of legal training in copyright law, but is a more inclusive concept about use, access, rights. I don't know, I have no...
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, unfortunately, I think the course that has been proposed thus far is, I mean, it's a one-credit course, and it's pretty heavily focused just on, legal copyright, which would at least include fair use. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, especially if, as librarians, if it's part of our professional ethos to try and support copyleft, as it might be called, right, and open access, like if those are things that we want to promote, then I think we do have to broaden our scope. Absolutely.
Like the ethics of information or something like that. I think that it's true that if you call something a course about copyright, it's almost like its own kind of it's a bias against a majority of things that you're talking about, and against a minority of things, seemingly minority of things, to have a perspective that information sharing and ethics is all about copyright. And you're right, it would potentially give off that impression that we're not focusing on users' rights. Yeah, I mean, I think legal and ethical issues surrounding the use of information could be, but also protection of your own. It's a really, how long do we have? Like how many characters?
Never mind a course. She's going to propose a whole program.
Exactly. And I just don't know how many characters I have for the title. You tell me, if it's a tweet, I got 140. But I don't. I mean, I've heard. I don't tweet, but I have to. So yeah, that's a really good point. I like the idea of making it more truthful to the entirety of what you want to discuss in it.
I keep looking on the other thing.
Yeah. Yes. Keep looking. Okay. All right, Maggie, and then I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
I just have beginning of the formation of a question that I'd be interested in your survey answering in terms of the confidence that people feel in their copyright literacy and how it affects their decision making in their library, and how scared they are to upload something because of who it's owned by and who they're going to get sued by. I was a associate producer for documentaries for years, and I did a lot of fair use stuff, which is embarrassing that I got that question wrong.
No, it wasn't wrong.
Or public domain, used that to, did international stuff too, because international was just whatever. But we would consciously avoid doing fair use from Fox or from Disney because their legal teams are so scary that we just didn't even want to deal with it. But if we were dealing with a small publishing house or whatever, that we would use that. So I'd just be wondering how intimidated are librarians by this law?
And I think some of it is what are librarians intimidated by, and what are their institutions intimidated by? Because their librarians may want to advocate for. I mean, the more you expand the definition of fair use, the better you have it when a legal professional, like a judge, wants to come down and say, what are libraries actually doing? Well, we're doing things that look really good in fair use. However, if your institution is more conservative in how much risk they're willing to take on, there's definitely going to be a tension between the advocacy that librarians may want for information sharing and the risk that institutions are willing to take on for potential legal, liability and stuff like that. So getting at that in the questions would be really interesting. I agree.
Yeah, and mine was just kind of, and this issue does get into kind of troubling territory. But when you talk about like sharing information and breaking or kind of being on the fence of copyright law, like kind of for the greater good, where if you have a patron in the library who honestly does not have the money to purchase textbooks, so they do kind of like copy a chapter and a chapter and a chapter and a chapter, while they might be going through community college or regular college, and eventually they breach that copyright law, and you know that, but you kind of ignore it for the greater good. But if like a student were to do that who clearly has the money and their excuse is I'm a poor college student, like that shouldn't pass. But how do you deal with those? Or have you thought of that?
Well, I do think about that. I would say some of it has to do with the cost of higher education and what you're getting included and what resources. If we want, I think it's about a level playing field for the students at a given institution. And I mean, I could imagine an argument being made that the institution should try to level the playing field for students, whether they're, I mean, I'm not advocating per se, but like the idea of having some sort of textbook allotment built into maybe the tuitions that are being charged and therefore either paid by the person or their parents or a scholarship or financial aid or the other ways that people fund their higher education. But I think you bring up a really good point that, educational purposes and retaining it for your own use, and that you wouldn't want to copy a whole book, but really if that's the only way you can do your work. Can you borrow reserves? We try to mitigate with reserves here at Simmons very much.
Well, that's what I was gonna say, is two quick things, because I know Candy's
It's
waiting
great.
to get into this. It is, definitely. I think there's two main things, which is one, I don't think the library is ever expected to police their individual patrons, right? So in other words, we can help educate them and guide them, but it's usually not our job to say like, oh, wait a minute, I've noticed that this is the 4th chapter you're copying from that book. But I do think what the library can and should do, in addition to trying to educate their patrons, is do whatever they can to mitigate those kinds of costs. So like Allison was saying, putting a book on reserve, so that, you do have to physically come to the library maybe to look at it, but at least you don't have to buy it. And now with digital books, with e-books, we're making it even easier for people because, then you have to have the software to access the book, but at least we're making them available to people in other ways where they don't necessarily have to even physically come and get it. So I think that's the kinds of things we can do. And then finally, educate our faculty to start using open access as much as possible. Right? And we do have to wrap it up. Thank you.